The crack of a gunshot echoed through the vast Montana plains as Lucas Shaw lowered his smoking revolver, a hardened glint in his steel-gray eyes. At 32, his face told a story of loss and retribution, etched with scars both visible and hidden beneath his sun-weathered skin. Goldfield, Montana in 1878 was the kind of place where a man's reputation preceded him, and Lucas Shaw's reputation was written in blood. "He's dead," Lucas announced flatly to the small gathering of men who had witnessed the showdown. The body of Charlie Daniels lay sprawled in the dusty Main Street, a red stain spreading across his chest. "He drew first," Lucas added, though no one had questioned it. No one ever did. The town marshal, a portly man with a salt and pepper mustache, sighed heavily. "That's the third man you've put in the ground this year, Shaw. Legal or not, you're turning Goldfield into a graveyard." Lucas holstered his weapon and tipped his hat slightly. "Some men can't be reasoned with, Marshal, and some debts can only be paid one way." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked toward the saloon, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step. Behind him, whispers followed like shadows. They called him the Unforgiving, a man who tracked those who had wronged him across states and territories, delivering his own brand of justice with unwavering determination. Few knew what fueled his vendetta, but all knew to stay clear of his path. The Double Eagle Saloon fell quiet as Lucas pushed through the swinging doors. He moved to the bar with the confidence of a predator, seemingly unbothered by the weight of the lives he'd taken or the glances cast in his direction. "Whiskey," he ordered, dropping coins onto the polished wood. The bartender, a nervous man named Rodney, poured quickly and retreated to the other end of the bar. Lucas took his drink to a corner table and sat with his back to the wall, a habit formed from years of watching for enemies. He was tired, bone tired, but he couldn't afford rest, not with two names still on his list. The paper was worn and creased from frequent handling, but the names were burned into his memory more indelibly than the ink on the page. The saloon gradually returned to its normal hum of activity as the patrons adjusted to his presence. Lucas nursed his whiskey, savoring the burn, when the doors swung open again, bringing with them a gust of wind and dust, and a woman unlike any Goldfield had seen before. She stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the harsh afternoon sun, dressed in a practical riding outfit rather than the frills and lace common to ladies of the West. Her dark blonde hair was partially contained in a simple bun, with rebellious strands framing a face that spoke of determination and intelligence. There was a quiet dignity in her posture that commanded attention without demanding it. Lucas watched with mild curiosity as she surveyed the room, her green eyes taking in every detail with careful assessment. When her gaze landed on him, he expected the usual reaction: fear, disgust, or hurried avoidance. Instead, she held his stare with an unflinching steadiness that stirred something unfamiliar within him. "That's Lucas Shaw," he overheard Rodney whisper to her when she approached the bar. "Best give him a wide berth, Miss Jones." "Thank you for your concern," she replied in a clear, melodious voice that carried across the room. "But I'll decide who deserves my attention and who doesn't." Lucas couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at her boldness. Most newcomers to Goldfield quickly learned to follow the established hierarchy of fear and respect. This woman seemed to operate by different rules entirely. She ordered a meal and took a seat at a table not far from his, positioning herself to observe the room much as he did. Their eyes met briefly again, and Lucas was surprised to find himself looking away first, a concession he rarely granted to anyone. The piano player in the corner struck up a lively tune, and the saloon girls began circulating among the tables, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. Lucas remained isolated in his corner, an island unto himself, occasionally glancing at the mysterious woman who seemed content in her own solitude. As the evening progressed, Lucas finished his whiskey and stood to leave. He had business to attend to, preparations for his journey to find the next man on his list. As he moved toward the door, a drunken cowboy stumbled into his path, spilling beer across Lucas's shirt. The room fell deathly silent. Everyone knew Lucas Shaw's temperament when crossed. "You got a death wish, boy?" Lucas asked quietly, his hand hovering near his holster. The young cowboy's face drained of color as he realized his mistake. "No, sir, Mr. Shaw, it was an accident, I swear it." Lucas stared at him, cold and calculating. The cowboy couldn't have been more than 20, probably new to town and unaware of who he'd offended. Another time, another place, Lucas might have drawn his gun for such an insult. But something held him back, perhaps the weariness that had been settling into his bones, or maybe the steady gaze of the woman who was now watching the confrontation with interest. "Buy me a new shirt," Lucas growled, brushing past the relieved young man. As he reached the swinging doors, a voice called out, "Mr. Shaw." He turned to find the woman approaching him, seemingly unconcerned by the tension still hanging in the air. "Miss Jones, is it?" he asked, his voice guarded. "Lillian Jones," she confirmed with a slight nod. "I understand you're familiar with the territories beyond Goldfield." Lucas studied her, trying to discern her intentions. "I've covered my share of ground. Why, I'm in need of a guide," she stated matter-of-factly. "I'm searching for someone and I'm willing to pay handsomely for assistance." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. No one hired Lucas Shaw, they avoided him. "I'm not for hire," he replied flatly. "Find someone else." Lillian didn't flinch at his dismissal. "From what I gather, you're the best tracker in the territory. I need the best." "What I do for myself," Lucas said, his patience waning. "Not for greenhorns with more money than sense." A flicker of something irritation, perhaps, or determination crossed her face. "I assure you, Mr. Shaw, I have ample amounts of both money and sense. What I lack is knowledge of this specific terrain and its dangers, but if you're not up to the challenge." The subtle questioning of his abilities was a clever tactic, Lucas had to admit. "Who are you looking for?" he found himself asking, against his better judgment. "My brother," she answered, her expression softening slightly. "He came west last year and his letters stopped 3 months ago. His last correspondence mentioned Goldfield." Lucas knew he should walk away. His own mission allowed no detours, no distractions. Yet something about Lillian Jones's directness intrigued him. "Come by the livery stable tomorrow morning," he heard himself say. "We'll discuss terms, no promises." With that, he pushed through the doors and into the night, wondering what had possessed him to even consider her request. The cool evening air cleared his head as he walked toward the small cabin he rented at the edge of town. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast Montana sky like silver dust. Lucas paused on his porch, looking up at the constellations he'd used for navigation on countless journeys. Tomorrow, he decided, he would hear Lillian Jones out and then send her on her way. His path was set, and there was no room on it for someone else's troubles. Inside his sparse cabin, Lucas lit a lamp and pulled out the worn piece of paper that had guided his existence for the past 3 years. 2 names remained. 2 men who had been part of the gang that had destroyed everything he once held dear. 2 men who still breathed while his family lay cold in their graves. He traced the names with his finger, a ritual that renewed his purpose. Justice or vengeance, as some might call it, was the only thing that kept him moving forward. Without it, there was nothing but an emptiness so vast it threatened to consume him entirely. As he prepared for sleep, Lucas found his thoughts drifting to Lillian Jones and her missing brother. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to help someone instead of hunting them. The thought was so foreign, so at odds with the man he'd become, that he dismissed it immediately. Morning came with the harsh reality of sunlight streaming through his window. Lucas rose, washed, and checked his weapons with practiced efficiency. He had a routine that had served him well for years: keep moving, trust no one, show no weakness. Yet as he made his way to the livery stable, he felt an unfamiliar uncertainty. Lillian was already there, dressed in practical riding clothes with a small trunk at her feet. Her hair was neatly braided, and she wore a determined expression that matched his own stubborn nature. "You're prompt," he observed. "That's something at least. Time is valuable, Mr. Shaw." "I don't believe in wasting it." Lucas leaned against a post, studying her. "Tell me about your brother." "Lawrence Jones," she began, producing a photograph from her pocket. 25 years old, Harvard-educated but always had a fascination with the West. He came out here to document the frontier for a book he planned to write. Lucas glanced at the photograph, a young man with the same determined eyes as his sister, though with a scholarly air about him. Academics don't last long out here without practical skills. Lawrence is more capable than he appears, Lillian defended. He's an excellent rider and a decent shot. He learned both before embarking on this journey. And you think he's in trouble? Lillian's composure faltered slightly. I know my brother. He wouldn't simply stop writing unless something prevented him from doing so. Lucas considered her words. What makes you think I can find him when the law couldn't? Because the law has other priorities, she replied evenly. And because your reputation suggests you don't give up easily once you've set your mind to something. The statement hit uncomfortably close to home. Lucas frowned. My reputation isn't exactly filled with charitable acts, Miss Jones. I'm not looking for charity, I'm offering employment. She named a sum that raised his eyebrows. Half now, half when we find Lawrence, regardless of his condition. The money was substantial enough to fund his own quest for months without the need to take odd jobs along the way. Still, Lucas hesitated. Entanglements with others always complicated matters, and complications got men killed. I work alone, he stated flatly. Not this time, Lillian countered with surprising firmness. He's my brother, I'm coming with you. Lucas almost laughed. No, absolutely not. The terrain is dangerous and I move fast. I'm an excellent rider, Mr. Shaw. I've been on horseback since I was 6 years old. I won't slow you down. It's not just about keeping pace, Lucas argued. There are outlaws, hostile Indians, wild animals, all the more reason I shouldn't travel alone, she interrupted smoothly. Which I will do if you refuse to take me with you. The threat in her statement was clear. She would search for her brother with or without him. Lucas cursed under his breath. Stubborn women were the last thing he needed. 3 days, he finally said. I'll give you 3 days of my time. If we don't find a solid lead by then, our arrangement ends, and you follow my instructions without question while we're on the trail. One argument and I leave you at the nearest settlement. Lillian considered his terms, then nodded. Agreed. When do we leave? 1 hour. Get whatever supplies you need and meet me back here. Wear practical clothes and pack light. As she turned to go, Lucas called after her and Miss Jones. Bring a weapon you know how to use. The surprise on her face gave way to understanding. I already have one, Mr. Shaw. True to her word, Lillian returned in exactly 1 hour, dressed for the journey with a small pack, and Lucas noted with approval, a revolver holstered at her side. The livery owner had prepared 2 horses, Lucas's own chestnut gelding and a sturdy bay mare for Lillian. You know how to ride astride, I assume? Lucas asked, eyeing her split riding skirt. I wouldn't have survived the journey from Boston otherwise, she replied, mounting the mare with practiced ease. Shall we? Lucas swung into his saddle and led them out of town, conscious of the curious gazes following their departure. The unforgiving riding out with a city woman would certainly give the gossips something to chew on. But reputation was the least of his concerns. They rode in silence for the first few miles, following the road northwest out of Goldfield. The spring sun warmed the air, and wildflowers dotted the prairie in splashes of color. It was the kind of day that might have lifted Lucas's spirits in another lifetime before loss had hardened his heart against beauty. Where are we headed? Lillian finally asked as they crested a rise overlooking a vast valley. Your brother mentioned Goldfield in his last letter. If he made it there, someone would have noticed him. Strangers stand out, especially educated Easterners. Lucas paused, considering his next words carefully. There's a small settlement about 15 miles north of here, little more than a trading post and a few cabins. It's on the way to the mountains, which would have interested someone writing about the frontier. Lillian nodded, absorbing the information. You know this territory well. It wasn't a question, but Lucas answered anyway. I've spent the better part of 3 years tracking through it. Tracking what, Mr. Shaw? The directness of her question caught him off guard. Most people avoided asking about his business, preferring the safety of ignorance. That's not relevant to our arrangement. Lillian studied him for a moment, then simply nodded. Fair enough. They continued riding, and Lucas found himself surprised by Lillian's endurance. She maintained the pace he set without complaint, her posture in the saddle suggesting years of experience rather than the casual riding lessons of a society woman. By mid-afternoon, they reached a small creek where Lucas suggested they rest the horses. As they dismounted, he noticed Lillian wince slightly. Not used to full days in the saddle, he asked, a hint of smugness in his tone. It's been a while, she admitted, stretching discreetly, but I'll manage. Lucas filled their canteens while Lillian tended to the horses, removing their bits so they could drink freely. There was a competence in her movements that contradicted his initial assessment of her as just another entitled Easterner. You said your brother was documenting the frontier, Lucas remarked as they sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree. Why? Lillian took a drink before answering. Lawrence believes the West is changing rapidly, that the frontier as it exists now will soon disappear. He wants to preserve its essence before it's gone forever. He's not wrong, Lucas conceded. 20 years ago, this was all Indian territory. Now there are towns sprouting up everywhere, railroads cutting across the plains. You don't approve? Lillian asked, studying his expression. Lucas shrugged. Change is inevitable, approval is irrelevant. That's a practical philosophy. It's the only kind that matters out here. Lucas stood, signaling the end of their break. We should keep moving if we want to reach Settlers Creek by nightfall. They remounted and continued their journey, the landscape gradually transitioning from open prairie to rolling hills dotted with pine and aspen groves. Lucas maintained a vigilant watch, scanning the horizon regularly for any signs of trouble. Have you always been so cautious, Mr. Shaw? Lillian asked after observing his behavior for several miles. Caution keeps you alive out here. Is that what drives you? Survival? Lucas cast her a sidelong glance. What drives me is my business, Miss Jones. Lillian, she corrected. If we're to travel together, even briefly, Miss Jones seems unnecessarily formal. Lucas didn't respond immediately, weighing the implications of such familiarity. Finally, he nodded curtly. Lillian, then. They rode in silence for another hour before Lillian spoke again. What should I know about Settlers Creek? Will the people there be forthcoming about strangers passing through? Depends on how you approach them, Lucas replied. They're suspicious of outsiders, but they respect direct questions and honest intentions. Your Eastern manners won't win you any favors, but your determination might. And how will they respond to you? She asked pointedly. Lucas's mouth tightened. They know me. Whether that helps or hinders us remains to be seen. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, the small collection of buildings that made up Settlers Creek came into view. It was a modest outpost, a trading post, a blacksmith shop, and a handful of cabins clustered around a central well. Smoke rose from several chimneys, carrying the scent of cooking fires into the early evening air. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. As they rode into the center of the settlement, faces appeared at windows and doors, wary and watchful. Lucas led them to a hitching post outside the trading post and dismounted, gesturing for Lillian to do the same. Let me do the talking initially, he instructed quietly. These people know me, but they're not necessarily fond of me. Before Lillian could respond, the door of the trading post opened, and a burly man with a thick gray beard stepped out, a shotgun held casually but visibly in his hands. Shaw, he acknowledged with a nod. Didn't expect to see you back this way. Fletcher, Lucas returned the greeting. Just passing through with some questions. Fletcher's gaze shifted to Lillian, his bushy eyebrows rising in surprise. Don't usually see you with company, especially the female kind. This is Miss Jones, Lucas said. She's hired me to find her brother. Fletcher lowered his shotgun slightly. Madam, he greeted with a nod that fell just short of respectful. What brings you to these parts? Lillian stepped forward, ignoring Lucas's earlier instruction. My brother, Lawrence Jones, was traveling through this region approximately 3 months ago. He may have stopped here on his way north. He's a writer documenting the Western Territories. Fletcher's expression remained impassive, but Lucas noted a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Might have seen someone fitting that description, Fletcher admitted reluctantly. Educated fellow, asking lots of questions about local history, Indian customs, and such. Hope brightened Lillian's face. That sounds like Lawrence. Did he say where he was headed? Fletcher glanced at Lucas, then back to Lillian. Said something about visiting the old Blackfoot trading grounds up in the foothills. Wanted to document some ancient pictographs in the caves there. Lucas frowned. That's disputed territory. The army's been pushing the remaining bands further north, but there are still warriors who consider those grounds sacred. I told him as much, Fletcher said with a shrug, but he seemed determined, said he had some kind of letter of passage from an Indian agent that would keep him safe. Lillian turned to Lucas, concern evident in her expression. Could that be why his letters stopped? If he encountered hostile Indians, Lucas didn't immediately answer, his mind working through the implications. When exactly did he pass through here? Early March, I reckon, Fletcher replied. Just as the passes were clearing from the winter snows. And no one's seen him since, Fletcher shook his head. Not here, but Jeremiah might know more. He guided your brother as far as Bear Creek before turning back. Where can we find this Jeremiah? Lillian asked. Cabin at the edge of the settlement, the one with the blue door. Fletcher nodded toward the west end of the small community. He might not be keen on visitors, though, been acting strange since he got back from that trip. Lucas thanked Fletcher and led Lillian back to their horses. We'll talk to Jeremiah, then find somewhere to make camp for the night, he said. I don't want to push further into the foothills after dark. As they walked toward Jeremiah's cabin, leading their horses, Lillian moved closer to Lucas. You're concerned about what Fletcher said, aren't you? About Jeremiah acting strange, Lucas nodded grimly. Men don't change without reason in these parts. If Jeremiah saw something on that journey that affected him, it might tell us what happened to your brother. The cabin stood slightly apart from the others, its blue door faded by sun and weather. A thin trail of smoke rose from the stone chimney, suggesting its occupant was home. Lucas tied their horses to a nearby post and approached the door, Lillian close behind him. He knocked firmly, then stepped back, his hand instinctively resting near his holster. After a long moment, the door creaked open a few inches, revealing a thin face with nervous eyes. What do you want? The man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jeremiah, Lucas confirmed. Name's Lucas Shaw, this is Lillian Jones. We're looking for information about Lawrence Jones, a man you guided toward Bear Creek in March. Jeremiah's eyes widened at the mention of Lawrence's name, and he attempted to close the door. Lucas's boot shot out, preventing it from shutting. We just want to talk, Lucas said firmly. His sister's worried about him. Jeremiah's gaze darted to Lillian, then back to Lucas. After a moment's hesitation, he opened the door wider. Come in then, but I don't have much to tell. The interior of the cabin was dimly lit and cluttered, with various herbs hanging from the rafters and strange symbols drawn on the walls. Lucas entered cautiously, Lillian following his lead. You guided my brother to Bear Creek, Lillian stated once they were inside. What happened on that journey? Jeremiah moved to a rickety table and sat, motioning for them to do the same. He was a good man, your brother, respectful, listened when I talked about the dangers. He paused, rubbing his hands together nervously. But he wouldn't turn back, not even when we saw the signs. What signs? Lucas pressed. Blackfoot markers, warning signs, the kind they leave to tell others to stay away from sacred grounds. Jeremiah's voice dropped even lower. And other signs, signs not made by any Indian tribe I know. Lucas exchanged a skeptical glance with Lillian. What do you mean by that? Jeremiah leaned forward, his eyes darting around as if afraid of being overheard. There's something in those caves that shouldn't be disturbed. The Indians know it. That's why they protected that place for generations. Did you see anything specific? Lillian asked, her voice gentle but insistent. Jeremiah hesitated. No, I wouldn't go past Bear Creek, but I heard things at night, sounds that didn't belong. Your brother, he laughed it off, said it was probably just mountain lions or wolves. His expression darkened. It wasn't animals. Lucas was losing patience with the man's vague warnings. Did Lawrence continue alone after you refused to go further? Jeremiah nodded. He had supplies for 2 weeks. said he'd return to Goldfield afterward to send his writings east. And you haven't heard from him since? Lillian pressed. No one has, Jeremiah confirmed, but there have been stories. Trappers coming down from the mountains telling of strange lights around the caves, voices on the wind. Lucas stood abruptly. Thank you for your time, Jeremiah. We'll be moving on now. Outside, as they untied their horses, Lillian confronted him. You don't believe him, do you, about the strange occurrences? I believe your brother continued into dangerous territory alone, Lucas replied. Whether the danger came from superstitious nonsense or more practical threats like hostile Indians or wild animals remains to be seen. So you think he might still be alive? Lucas met her hopeful gaze directly. I think we need more information before drawing any conclusions. But I won't lie to you, men who venture into those mountains alone don't often return, especially if they are unfamiliar with the territory. They led their horses toward the edge of the settlement, where Lucas knew of a suitable camping spot near a small stream. As they walked, he noticed Lillian's determined expression, the way she squared her shoulders against the weight of uncertainty. You really care about your brother, he observed. Lillian glanced at him, surprised by the personal comment. Of course. He's my only family since our parents passed away 5 years ago. We've always looked out for each other. Lucas nodded, a distant memory of his own family briefly surfacing before he pushed it away. Family ties can be powerful motivators. What about you, Mr. Shaw? Lillian asked carefully. Do you have family somewhere? The question cut deeper than she could know. Not anymore, he replied curtly, effectively ending the conversation. They made camp as twilight settled over the landscape, Lucas efficiently building a small fire while Lillian unsaddled the horses and secured them for the night. They worked in silence, each respecting the other's space and tasks. As they sat by the fire eating a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, Lucas finally spoke again. We'll head toward Bear Creek at first light. It's a day's ride from here following the northern trail. If your brother left any sign of his passing, we might pick up his trail there. Lillian nodded, her face illuminated by the dancing flames. Thank you for taking this seriously, despite Jeremiah's eccentricities. Mountain folk develop strange notions when they spend too much time alone, Lucas commented. But sometimes, their warnings have a basis in reality, even if they're wrapped in superstition. You think there might be something dangerous in those caves? Lucas considered his words carefully. I think any remote location can harbor threats, natural or human. The Blackfoot consider certain sites sacred, and they don't take kindly to trespassers. If your brother ignored their warnings, he might have encountered resistance. But you don't believe in curses or supernatural dangers, Lillian observed, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I believe in what I can see, touch, and fight, Lucas replied flatly. Everything else is distraction. Lillian studied him across the fire. That's a rather limited perspective for someone who's traveled so extensively. Surely you've encountered things that defy simple explanation. Lucas poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. The world is complicated enough without adding ghosts and spirits to the mix. And yet, Lillian persisted gently, there are mysteries in this world that reason alone can't solve. Like what happened to your brother? Lucas challenged, Lillian's expression sobered. Exactly. Logic tells me he may have met with an accident or encountered hostile people, but something deeper, call it intuition or faith, tells me he's still alive, waiting to be found. Lucas didn't respond immediately, finding himself unexpectedly moved by her unwavering hope. In his experience, hope was a luxury that reality inevitably crushed. Yet Lillian clung to hers with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. We'll find answers, he finally said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. One way or another. Lillian smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her features and stirred something long dormant within Lucas. That's all I ask. They fell into silence as the fire burned lower. Lucas took the first watch, insisting Lillian get some rest before their journey continued. As she settled into her bedroll, he found himself watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing, struck by the strange twist of fate that had brought this determined woman into his solitary existence. For 3 years, he had walked a path of vengeance, allowing no room for connections or complications. Now, in the span of a day, Lillian Jones had somehow breached his carefully constructed defenses, making him question if only briefly the single-minded purpose that had driven him for so long. Dawn broke with a riot of color across the eastern sky. Lucas, who had eventually dozed off during the quietest hours of the night, awoke instantly at the first light. He found Lillian already up, tending to a small breakfast fire with efficiency that spoke of preparation rather than natural aptitude. "You've done this before," he observed, rising from his bedroll. Lillian glanced up, a hint of surprise in her expression. "I spent 6 months practicing essential frontier skills before making this journey. I didn't want to be a burden to whoever helped me search for Lawrence." Lucas nodded appreciatively. Too many Easterners ventured west with romantic notions and inadequate preparation, becoming liabilities to themselves and others. Lillian's practical approach suggested a depth of character he hadn't initially credited her with. They ate a quick breakfast of coffee and biscuits before breaking camp and saddling the horses. The morning air carried a crisp freshness, and the distant mountains stood in sharp relief against the clear sky. "Bear Creek is northwest of here," Lucas explained as they mounted. "The trail follows that ridgeline before dipping into the valley beyond. It's rough country but beautiful in its own way." "You sound almost fond of it," Lillian observed. Lucas considered this. A man can appreciate the land without being fond of what happens on it. They rode steadily through the morning, the terrain gradually becoming more rugged as they approached the foothills. Lucas set a challenging pace, but Lillian kept up without complaint, her determination evident in the set of her jaw and the straight line of her spine. By midday, they had reached a high overlook that provided a sweeping view of the valley below. Lucas reined in his horse and dismounted, gesturing for Lillian to join him at the edge. "Bear Creek runs through that valley," he explained, pointing to a thin line of green vegetation that snaked through the landscape. "The caves your brother was seeking are in those cliffs to the north." Lillian studied the terrain intently. It seemed so vast. "How will we find any sign of him after all this time?" "We look for what others miss," Lucas replied. "Broken branches, disturbed stones, remnants of campfires. The land keeps its own record of those who pass through it." As they prepared to continue their journey, a movement on the far side of the valley caught Lucas's attention. He reached for his field glass, focusing on the distant figures. "What is it?" Lillian asked, noting his sudden alertness. Riders, 3 of them, moving along the base of the cliffs. Lucas adjusted the glass for a better view. "Not Indians, white men, heavily armed. Could they be army scouts?" Lucas shook his head. "Wrong direction for patrol routes, and they're moving too cautiously. My guess would be outlaws or deserters using the caves for shelter." "Could they have encountered Lawrence?" Lillian asked, a new worry creasing her brow. "It's possible," Lucas conceded, collapsing the field glass and returning it to his saddlebag. "Which means we need to approach carefully. If they're still in the area, they might view us as a threat." They descended into the valley, Lucas leading them along a route that offered more cover from potential observers. The terrain became increasingly difficult, with loose shale and steep drop-offs requiring their full attention. By late afternoon, they reached the banks of Bear Creek itself, a swift, clear stream cutting through the valley floor. Lucas dismounted, examining the ground near the water's edge. "This would be a natural place to camp," he explained, scanning for any signs of previous visitors. "Water, shelter from the wind, good visibility of approaches." Lillian joined him in the search, her eyes keen despite her lack of tracking experience. After several minutes of methodical examination, she called to Lucas. "Is this something?" she asked, pointing to what appeared to be the remnants of a fire pit, now overgrown with new grass. Lucas knelt beside it, brushing away the vegetation to reveal charred stones arranged in a circular pattern. "Good eye," he commended. "This is a few months old at least." "Could have been your brother's campsite." Encouraged, they expanded their search, examining the surrounding area for additional clues. Near the base of a large boulder, Lucas discovered something that quickened his pulse: a small leather-bound notebook, its pages swollen and partially ruined by exposure to the elements. "Lillian," he called, holding up the find. "Does this look familiar?" She hurried over, taking the notebook with trembling hands. "It's Lawrence's journal," she confirmed after examining it. "He always kept detailed notes of his observations. He would never willingly leave this behind." Lucas watched as she carefully opened the damp pages, searching for any legible entries. "The last dates I can make out are from mid-March," she reported. "He mentions making contact with a small band of Blackfoot, who were surprisingly accommodating after he showed them his letter of introduction from the Indian agent." "What else?" Lucas prompted, sensing there was more. Lillian's expression grew troubled as she turned to the final readable pages. "He writes about discovering the entrance to the cave system, says it's more extensive than local legends suggested, with evidence of human habitation dating back centuries." She looked up at Lucas. "The last entry mentions hearing strange noises deep within the cave network and his intention to investigate further the next day." Lucas frowned, a sense of unease settling over him. "And nothing after that?" Lillian shook her head, carefully closing the journal. "The remaining pages are too damaged to read, if he wrote anything at all." They stood in silence for a moment, each absorbing the implications of their discovery. The journal confirmed Lawrence had reached his destination, but provided no clues about what might have happened afterward. "The caves are our next stop," Lucas decided, glancing at the position of the sun. "But not today. We've got maybe 2 hours of daylight left, and I don't want to be fumbling around unknown cave systems in the dark." They made camp near the creek, positioning themselves differently than the previous occupant had, a precaution Lucas insisted on in case whoever had been watching from the cliffs decided to investigate. As Lillian prepared a small fire, Lucas secured the horses and set up a perimeter of thin twine with small bells, a primitive but effective alarm system. "You're expecting trouble," Lillian observed as he completed the arrangement. Lucas checked his revolver before settling near the fire. "I always expect trouble. It's why I'm still alive." As darkness fell, the sounds of the wilderness intensified: the haunting call of a distant wolf, the rustling of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush, the constant murmur of the creek. Lucas maintained a vigilant watch, his senses attuned to any disturbance that might signal danger. Lillian sat across from him, the firelight casting shadows across her thoughtful face. "May I ask you something personal, Mr. Shaw?" Lucas tensed slightly but nodded. "You can ask." "Doesn't mean I'll answer." "What drives a man to become what you are?" she asked directly. "Fletcher's reaction to you, the whispers in Goldfield, they suggest a reputation built on more than just tracking skills." For a long moment, Lucas remained silent, debating how much to reveal. Finally he spoke, his voice low and controlled. 3 years ago, I had a ranch in the Wyoming Territory, a wife named Sarah, a 2-year-old son, William. The names felt strange on his tongue after so long avoiding them. "I was away delivering horses to a neighboring ranch when a group of men raided our property." Lillian's expression softened with understanding. "They killed your family." Lucas stared into the flames, the memory as sharp as a fresh wound. "They killed everyone, burned everything to the ground. By the time I returned, there was nothing left but ashes and graves." He paused, his jaw tightening. "The local law didn't care much, said it was probably renegade Indians or passing outlaws, case closed." "But you didn't accept that," Lillian surmised quietly. "I tracked them," Lucas continued, his voice hardening. 5 men. Took me 6 months to identify the first one. He was tending bar in a Colorado mining town, living under a different name, but I knew him by a distinctive scar on his hand that a witness had described. "And you killed him," Lillian stated rather than asked. Lucas met her gaze across the fire. "I gave him the justice the law wouldn't. Him and 2 others since then. 2 remain." Instead of the judgment or fear he expected, Lillian's expression held a complex mixture of compassion and sadness. "And you believe this will bring you peace?" "I don't expect peace," Lucas replied honestly. "I expect justice." There's a difference between justice and vengeance, Lillian observed gently, not from where I stand. Lucas's tone made it clear the subject was closed. They sat in silence for a time, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Lillian spoke again, her voice softer. "Thank you for telling me. I understand better now." Lucas nodded slightly, uncomfortable with both her gratitude and the strange relief he felt at having shared his burden, if only partially. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be challenging." Lillian prepared her bedroll but paused before lying down. "Whatever happened to my brother, I'm grateful you're helping me find out, regardless of your reasons." As she settled in for the night, Lucas remained by the fire, turning her words over in his mind. For 3 years, his existence had been defined by a single purpose: tracking and eliminating the men responsible for destroying his life. The quest had left no room for connections, for considerations beyond survival and vengeance. Yet here he was, diverting from his path to help a woman search for her missing brother, sharing details of his past he had locked away from all others. The realization was unsettling, as if the foundations of the identity he had carefully constructed were shifting beneath him. Morning arrived with a heavy mist clinging to the valley floor, reducing visibility to mere yards. Lucas rose at first light, his body stiff from the night's vigil. Despite the discomfort, he felt oddly refreshed, as if the unburdening of his past had somehow lightened his physical load as well. Lillian joined him shortly after, her hair neatly braided and her expression determined. "The fog will make tracking difficult," she observed, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "It works both ways," Lucas replied. "Makes it harder for others to spot us too." They ate a quick breakfast and broke camp efficiently, leaving minimal evidence of their presence. Lucas led them northward along the creek, following it toward the cliff face where the cave entrances were reportedly located. The mist began to dissipate as the morning sun gained strength, revealing the imposing limestone cliffs ahead. Lucas scanned the rock face carefully as they approached, looking for any signs of the cave entrances Lawrence had mentioned in his journal. "There," Lillian pointed toward a dark opening about 20 feet up a steep slope of loose rock. "That could be one of them." Lucas studied the approach thoughtfully. "Looks accessible, but we'll need to secure the horses before attempting the climb." They found a suitable location to leave the animals, a small copse of trees with access to water and enough grass for grazing. Lucas removed essential supplies from his saddlebags, including extra ammunition, rope, and 2 improvised torches. "Stay behind me," he instructed as they began the ascent toward the cave entrance. "Watch where I step and follow exactly. This scree is unstable." The climb was treacherous, with loose rocks sliding beneath their boots and threatening to send them tumbling back down. Lillian proved surprisingly agile, maintaining her balance even when the ground shifted beneath her. Upon reaching the cave entrance, Lucas paused to examine the surrounding rock face. There were marks carved into the stone symbols he recognized from his encounters with various tribes. "Blackfoot warnings," he explained, tracing one of the signs with his finger. "Telling people to stay away." Lawrence mentioned these in his journal, Lillian confirmed. He believed they were meant to protect sacred sites rather than warn of physical danger. Lucas lit one of the torches, the flame casting eerie shadows across the cave entrance. "Your brother might have been right about their purpose, but that doesn't mean there isn't real danger inside. Stay close." The cave opening led to a narrow passage that descended gently into the earth. Lucas moved cautiously, alert for any signs of recent activity. The air grew cooler as they progressed deeper, carrying a faint mineral scent and the distant sound of dripping water. After about 50 yards, the passage opened into a larger chamber with several branching tunnels leading off in different directions. The torch illuminated ancient paintings on the walls, hunting scenes, celestial patterns, and more abstract designs that defied immediate interpretation. "It's beautiful," Lillian whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the chamber. Lawrence must have been fascinated. Lucas knelt to examine the ground, sweeping the torch low to reveal any tracks or disturbances in the fine dust. Near one of the tunnel entrances, he found what he was looking for: footprints, partially obscured but still discernible. "Someone came this way," he announced, studying the impressions. "The tread pattern suggests Eastern-made boots. Could be your brother." Lillian joined him, hope brightening her features. "Which way did he go?" Lucas indicated the leftmost passage. "This tunnel, and he wasn't alone. See these other tracks, different size, different pattern. At least 2 other people were with him, or following him," Lillian suggested grimly. They proceeded into the indicated tunnel, which twisted and turned, occasionally narrowing to the point where they had to turn sideways to continue. Throughout their progress, Lucas noted signs of previous passage scuff marks on the walls, occasional bootprints in patches of damp earth, and once a piece of tattered fabric caught on a jagged rock outcropping. After what felt like hours of careful advancement, they emerged into another chamber, this one larger than the first and dominated by a still pool of water in its center. The torch light reflected off the surface, creating dancing patterns on the high ceiling above. "Look," Lillian gasped, pointing to the far side of the chamber. Lucas raised the torch higher, illuminating what appeared to be the remnants of a camp, a cold fire pit, scattered supplies, and what looked like a collapsed tent or tarpaulin. They circled the pool, approaching the abandoned camp cautiously. As they drew closer, Lucas noted signs of a struggle, equipment strewn haphazardly, a broken lantern, dark stains on the stone floor that might have been blood. Lillian rushed forward to examine the scattered items, her hands trembling as she lifted a familiar-looking leather satchel. "This is Lawrence's," she confirmed, opening it to reveal papers and sketching materials. "He would never willingly leave it behind." Lucas surveyed the scene with a practiced eye, trying to reconstruct what might have happened. "There was a fight here," he concluded. "Multiple participants, but no bodies, which suggests whoever lost was taken elsewhere, either as prisoner or for burial. Could Lawrence have been taken prisoner?" Lillian asked, clinging to the possibility that her brother might still be alive. Before Lucas could respond, a sound echoed from one of the connecting tunnels, the unmistakable clink of metal on stone, followed by hushed voices. Lucas immediately extinguished their torch, plunging the chamber into near darkness, the only illumination coming from a faint phosphorescence in the pool water. "Someone's coming," he whispered, drawing Lillian behind a large stalagmite formation. "Don't move." They crouched in silence as light gradually filled the chamber lantern light, steadier and brighter than their torch had been. 3 men emerged from the tunnel, their features harsh in the artificial illumination. "I'm telling you, I heard something," one of them insisted, a tall man with a prominent scar across his chin. "Probably just bats or rats," another replied dismissively. "This place is full of them." The third man, older and more weathered than his companions, raised his hand for silence. "Check the cache. Make sure everything's still there." Lucas felt Lillian tense beside him as the men moved toward the far side of the chamber, where a pile of crates was partially concealed behind a rocky outcropping. The contents of the crates quickly became apparent: rifles, ammunition, and what appeared to be dynamite. "Outlaws," Lucas mouthed silently to Lillian. Using the caves as a hideout, the older man pried open one of the crates and examined its contents with satisfaction. "All present. Now let's check on our guest. Been a while since we brought him food." At this, Lillian clutched Lucas's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. The implication was clear: they might be holding someone prisoner deeper in the cave system. The men gathered additional supplies from their cache and disappeared down another tunnel, their lantern light gradually fading until the chamber was once again illuminated only by the ghostly glow of the pool. "My brother," Lillian whispered urgently once the men were out of earshot. "They must be holding Lawrence. We have to follow them." Lucas weighed their options quickly. "It's too dangerous to follow directly. They're armed and know the cave system better than we do. We need a different approach. We can't just leave him." "We won't," Lucas assured her. "But rushing in blindly will get us both killed, and then your brother has no chance at all." He relit their torch, keeping the flame low to minimize visibility from a distance. Let's examine the rest of this chamber first. There might be other passages or clues about the layout of these caves. They searched methodically, keeping alert for any sounds of the outlaws returning. On the opposite side of the pool, partially hidden behind a curtain of stalactites, Lucas discovered another tunnel entrance. This might run parallel to the one they took, he speculated, examining the passage. See these marks on the wall? They're not natural formations. Someone's been using this route regularly. Indians, Lillian suggested. Lucas shook his head. More likely whoever was here before the outlaws, perhaps even your brother mapping the cave system. They decided to follow this alternative route, hoping it might lead them closer to where Lawrence might be held without directly confronting the armed men. The passage was narrower and less traveled than the main tunnels, requiring them to stoop at points and navigate around fallen rocks and tight squeezes. After what felt like an eternity of careful progress, they began to hear voices again, distant at first, then gradually clearer. Lucas extinguished the torch once more as they approached what appeared to be a small opening in the passage wall. Peering through, Lucas could see into another chamber, this one clearly being used as the outlaws' main camp. Bedrolls were arranged around a central fire pit, and supplies were stacked against one wall. The three men they had observed earlier were seated near the fire, passing a bottle between them. And there, bound to a stalagmite column at the edge of the chamber, was a man who could only be Lillian Jones. Even in the dim light, the family resemblance was unmistakable. He had the same determined set to his jaw as Lillian, though his face was now gaunt with deprivation and marred by bruises. His clothing was tattered and his posture suggested injury or weakness, but he was undeniably alive. Lillian stifled a gasp at the sight of her brother. Lucas placed a restraining hand on her arm, warning her to remain silent. They needed to observe and plan before attempting any rescue. The outlaws' conversation gradually became audible as Lucas and Lillian positioned themselves closer to the opening. "I still say we should just kill him and be done with it," the scarred man was saying. "He's more trouble than he's worth." "And I say he might still be useful," the older man countered. "His sister's wealthy. Once Jenkins returns from Goldfield with information about her, we can demand a proper ransom." Lucas felt Lillian stiffen beside him at the mention of herself. "It's been 3 months, the third man complained. If his fancy Eastern family was going to look for him, they'd have done it by now. "Patience," the leader advised. "Good things come to those who wait. Besides, we need to lie low after that bank job in Helena. These caves are perfect until the heat dies down." The pieces fell into place for Lucas. These weren't just random outlaws, they were bank robbers using the remote cave system as a hideout. Lawrence had stumbled upon them during his exploration and become their prisoner, perhaps initially kept alive because of his knowledge of the caves, and later as potential leverage for ransom. He turned to Lillian, indicating they should retreat a safe distance to discuss their next move. Once they were far enough away to speak without being overheard, he outlined his assessment of the situation. "There are 3 of them that we've seen, possibly more if others are out scouting or on other business. They're well armed and comfortable in their surroundings." Lucas kept his voice low. "But they're also overconfident and getting careless. They don't expect anyone to find them here." "How do we get Lawrence out?" Lillian asked, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her posture. Lucas considered their options. A direct confrontation would be risky, especially with Lawrence unable to assist in his own rescue. Stealth offered better odds but would require perfect timing. "We wait until nightfall," he decided. "They'll sleep in shifts, meaning we'll likely face only one alert guard at a time. The darkness will help conceal our movements." Lillian nodded in agreement. "What's our approach?" "I'll create a distraction to draw the guard away from Lawrence. You slip in from this passage and free him, then all 3 of us exit through here and make our way back to the horses." "And if something goes wrong," Lucas met her gaze directly, "then I'll improvise, but one way or another, we're getting your brother out of there tonight." They retreated further down the passage to wait, conserving their torch and sharing the last of their provisions. As they sat in the semi-darkness, Lucas found himself studying Lillian's profile, impressed by her composure in the face of such danger. "You've handled all this remarkably well," he observed quietly. "Most people would have fallen apart by now," Lillian offered a small smile. "I've never had the luxury of falling apart. After our parents died, Lawrence and I had to be strong for each other." She glanced toward the passage that led to her captive brother. "Besides, fear doesn't help solve problems. Action does." Lucas nodded, recognizing the philosophy that had guided his own existence since the loss of his family. "Your brother is lucky to have you." "As am I to have found you," Lillian replied with quiet sincerity. "I don't believe I would have located Lawrence without your help." The acknowledgement created an unexpected warmth in Lucas's chest, a sensation so unfamiliar that he almost didn't recognize it as pride. For 3 years, his actions had been driven solely by vengeance, bringing fear and death rather than aid and hope. This unfamiliar role of rescuer rather than avenger stirred something he had thought long dead within him. As the hours passed, they occasionally crept back to their observation point to monitor the outlaws' activities. As Lucas had predicted, they eventually settled in for the night with one man remaining on watch while the others slept. "It's time," Lucas whispered once the camp had quieted sufficiently. "Remember the plan. Wait for my distraction, then move quickly and quietly. Don't try to gather Lawrence's belongings. We can come back for them later if necessary." Lillian nodded, her expression resolute. "Be careful." Lucas allowed himself a small smile. "Always am." He made his way back through the passage, emerging at the pool chamber they had discovered earlier. From there, he followed the main tunnel the outlaws had used, moving silently despite the challenging terrain. As he approached the outlaws' camp from the main entrance, he paused to prepare his distraction, a small bundle of dynamite taken from his pack, with a shortened fuse. It wasn't enough to cause a cave-in, but would create a significant noise and confusion. Positioning himself near the tunnel intersection farthest from Lawrence's location, Lucas struck a match and lit the fuse. He waited until it was burning steadily, then tossed the bundle deeper into the unused passage before retreating to a strategic position with good visibility of the camp. The explosion echoed through the cave system with a deafening roar, accompanied by a cloud of dust and debris that billowed from the tunnel entrance. As expected, all 3 outlaws were immediately awake and alert, weapons drawn. "What the hell was that?" the scarred man demanded. "Check it out," the leader ordered, gesturing toward the source of the explosion. "Could be a cave-in or someone trying to blast their way in." 2 of the men, including the leader, moved cautiously toward the affected tunnel, leaving only the 3rd man to guard Lawrence. Lucas waited until they were out of sight, then took aim with his revolver and fired a single shot that struck the rock wall near the remaining guard's head. The man dove for cover, returning fire toward Lucas's position. Using the exchange as cover, Lucas glimpsed Lillian emerging from their hidden passage and moving swiftly toward her brother. Lucas continued to trade shots with the guard, deliberately keeping his aim wide to maintain the distraction without causing fatalities that might complicate their escape. From the corner of his eye, he saw Lillian cutting Lawrence's bonds and helping him to his feet. The commotion had alerted the other outlaws, who were now returning from their investigation of the explosion. Lucas intensified his fire, forcing them to seek cover and buying precious seconds for Lillian and Lawrence to reach the hidden passage. Once they were safely out of sight, Lucas began his own retreat, firing strategically to discourage pursuit while backing toward the main tunnel. The outlaws returned fire aggressively, bullets ricocheting off the cave walls around him. As he reached the tunnel entrance, a searing pain tore through his left shoulder, a bullet finding its mark despite the darkness. Lucas staggered but kept moving, knowing that stopping meant certain death. The tunnels were a maze of twisting passages, but Lucas had mentally mapped their route during the initial exploration. Despite the pain clouding his thoughts and the warm blood soaking his shirt, he navigated confidently toward the pool chamber where he was to rejoin Lillian and Lawrence. Behind him, he could hear the outlaws organizing their pursuit, their voices echoing off the stone walls. They knew the cave system better than he did, which meant speed was essential. Reaching the pool chamber, Lucas found Lillian supporting her weakened brother, anxiety clear on her face as she watched for his arrival. "You're hurt," she gasped, noticing the blood on his clothing. "It's nothing that can't wait," Lucas replied grimly. "We need to move." "They'll be right behind us." Together they helped Lawrence through the narrow passage that would lead them back to the cave entrance. The injured man was weak from months of captivity but determined, pushing his body beyond its limits in this bid for freedom. The sounds of pursuit grew more distant as they navigated the less traveled route, suggesting the outlaws were searching the main tunnels first. Still, Lucas maintained their pace, knowing their advantage was temporary. After what felt like an eternity of careful movement through the dark passages, they finally glimpsed natural light ahead the cave entrance through which they had entered hours before. "Almost there," Lucas encouraged as Lawrence stumbled. "Just a little further." They emerged into the late afternoon sunlight, the brightness momentarily blinding after so long underground. Lucas quickly assessed their position and the descent path. "The scree slope is dangerous, but it's our fastest route down," he explained. "Take it slow and steady." "I'll go last to cover our retreat if necessary." Lillian helped Lawrence begin the treacherous descent, supporting him when his strength faltered. Lucas followed a few paces behind, his wounded shoulder protesting with each movement, his revolver ready for any pursuit. They had made it halfway down when shouts from above confirmed the outlaws had discovered their escape route. Bullets whizzed past them, kicking up dust and rock fragments from the slope. "Keep going." Lucas called, turning to return fire, providing covering fire as Lillian and Lawrence continued their descent. A lucky shot from above struck near Lucas's feet, dislodging the unstable rock beneath him. He lost his footing and tumbled down the slope, unable to arrest his fall as loose shale and gravel carried him in a painful slide toward the bottom. He came to rest near the base of the slope, momentarily stunned by the impact. Lillian's voice penetrated the haze of pain, urgent and frightened. "Lucas, get up! They're coming!" The use of his first name, something she had never done before, cut through his disorientation. Lucas forced himself to his feet, ignoring the fresh injuries from the fall and the worsening condition of his shoulder. They ran for the copse of trees where they had left the horses, Lucas now leaning on Lillian almost as heavily as Lawrence did. The animals were agitated but present, sensing the danger but restrained by their tethers. "Lawrence will ride with me," Lillian decided quickly. "Can you manage on your own?" Lucas nodded tersely, using his good arm to pull himself into the saddle. "Head southwest toward that ridge line. There's a ravine beyond it where we can lose them." They rode hard, pushing the horses to their limits across the open ground. Behind them, the outlaws had reached their own mounts and were in pursuit, their angry shouts carried on the wind. The ridge line Lucas had indicated appeared in the distance, a promising barrier that might give them the advantage they needed. As they rode, he noticed Lawrence's condition with concern. The man was barely conscious, slumped against his sister, kept in the saddle only by Lillian's firm grip and sheer determination. Lucas's own strength was fading, the blood loss from his shoulder wound taking its toll. The landscape blurred around him as he focused solely on staying upright and moving forward. They crested the ridge and descended into the ravine beyond, a steep-sided gully carved by seasonal floods. The narrower terrain favored them, making it harder for their pursuers to flank them or use superior numbers to advantage. "There's a place to ford ahead," Lucas called, guiding them toward a section where the ravine widened and the stream bed flattened. "Once across, we can use those rocks for cover." They splashed through the shallow water and positioned themselves among the massive boulders on the opposite bank. Lucas dismounted painfully, helping Lillian get Lawrence to relative safety before drawing his rifle from its scabbard. "Stay with your brother," he instructed, checking his ammunition. "I'll hold them off." Lillian's expression was one of protest. "You're in no condition to fight." "We don't have a choice," Lucas replied simply. They'll keep coming unless I convince them otherwise." Before she could argue further, the sounds of approaching riders echoed down the ravine. Lucas positioned himself behind a boulder, steadying the rifle against the stone surface to compensate for his weakened state. The first outlaw appeared at the ford, hesitating as he searched for signs of their passage. Lucas took careful aim and fired, the shot striking the water directly in front of the man's horse. The animal reared in panic, nearly unseating its rider. "That's far enough," Lucas called out. "The next shot won't be a warning." The three outlaws conferred briefly, then the leader called back. "You're outnumbered and outgunned, mister. Hand over the prisoner and we'll let you and the woman ride away." "Not going to happen," Lucas responded, punctuating his refusal with another warning shot that forced the men to duck behind their own cover. What followed was a tense exchange of fire, with Lucas carefully managing his ammunition while the outlaws attempted to advance across the ford. Despite his injured state, Lucas's marksmanship remained formidable, keeping the men pinned down and unable to gain ground. As the standoff continued, Lucas became aware of movement beside him. Lillian had retrieved her own revolver and taken position at an adjacent boulder. "I told you to stay back," he growled. "And I chose not to listen," she replied calmly, firing a shot that forced one of the outlaws to retreat from an exposed position. "Lawrence is stable for now. You need the help." Lucas wanted to argue but recognized the logic in her actions. Together, they maintained a more effective defense than he could have managed alone in his wounded state. The exchange continued until sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, the fading light working to their advantage. In the growing darkness, the outlaws would have an increasingly difficult time targeting their positions. "They'll have to give up soon," Lucas observed during a lull in the shooting. "They can't afford to waste ammunition indefinitely, and they won't risk the dark." As if confirming his assessment, the outlaws' leader called out once more. "This isn't over. We know what you look like now. There's nowhere in the territory you can hide." "Let them think what they want," Lillian said quietly. "By the time they regroup, we'll be long gone." They waited in silence as the outlaws reluctantly withdrew, the sounds of their retreat fading into the distance. Only then did Lucas allow himself to acknowledge the full extent of his injuries, the bullet wound in his shoulder, the various cuts and bruises from his fall, and the bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. "We need to keep moving," he insisted, struggling to his feet. "They might circle back once they think we've lowered our guard." Lillian studied him with concern. "You need medical attention, so does Lawrence." "There's a trapper's cabin about 5 miles south of here," Lucas recalled. "It should be empty this time of year. We can rest there and tend to our wounds before continuing to Goldfield." The journey to the cabin was a blur for Lucas, who remained in the saddle through sheer force of will. Lillian led the way, supporting her brother while periodically checking on Lucas's condition. By the time they reached the small log structure nestled in a grove of pine trees, night had fallen completely, and Lucas was fighting to remain conscious. The cabin was indeed abandoned, though stocked with basic provisions, the unwritten code of the frontier dictating that such shelters be left prepared for travelers in need. Lillian quickly organized their sanctuary, lighting a fire in the stone hearth and preparing a space for Lawrence to rest. "Your turn," she said to Lucas, her tone brooking no argument as she guided him to a chair near the fire. "That bullet needs to come out." Lucas didn't have the strength to protest as she carefully removed his bloodied shirt and examined the wound. Her touch was gentle but confident as she cleaned the area with water warmed by the fire. "This will hurt," she warned, producing a small knife from her pack. "But it needs to be done." Lucas nodded grimly. "Not my first bullet wound. Do what you need to do." Lillian worked with surprising skill, locating and extracting the bullet embedded in his shoulder muscle. Despite his determination to remain stoic, Lucas couldn't suppress a groan of pain as she probed the wound. "You've done this before," he observed through gritted teeth. "I volunteered in a hospital during the war," Lillian explained, applying a poultice of herbs she had gathered earlier. I was young, but they needed all the help they could get. As she bandaged his shoulder, Lucas found himself studying her face in the firelight, the concentration in her eyes, the determined set of her mouth, the strand of hair that had escaped her braid to curl against her cheek. There was a strength in her that he hadn't fully appreciated until now. "Thank you," he said quietly when she had finished. The words felt inadequate for what she had done, not just tending his wound, but standing beside him in the fight, maintaining her courage throughout their ordeal. Lillian met his gaze, a small smile softening her features. "You're welcome." "Now rest, I'll keep watch, Lawrence." Lucas began, glancing toward the man sleeping on a makeshift pallet. "Is exhausted and malnourished, but not critically injured," Lillian assured him. "The outlaws wanted him alive for ransom. They roughed him up but were careful not to do lasting damage." Lucas nodded, relief easing some of the tension from his body. Against all odds, they had succeeded. Lillian had found her brother, and both were safe, at least for the moment. As exhaustion claimed him, Lucas's last conscious thought was that for the first time in 3 years, he had used his skills to preserve life rather than take it. The realization brought an unfamiliar sense of peace that followed him into sleep. He awoke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's small window and the smell of coffee brewing over the fire. For a moment, disorientation gripped him, the unfamiliar surroundings, the absence of the constant vigilance that had defined his existence for so long. "Good morning," Lillian greeted from where she sat beside her brother, who was awake and sitting up, though still obviously weak. "How's the shoulder?" Lucas experimentally moved the injured limb, wincing at the sharp pain but noting that the wound hadn't reopened. "It'll do. How long was I out?" "About 12 hours, Lillian replied with a hint of amusement. "Apparently even the infamous Lucas Shaw needs rest occasionally." Lawrence observed their interaction with interest, his intelligent eyes moving between them. Despite his ordeal, there was a dignity in his bearing that matched his sister's. "Mr. Shaw," he acknowledged. "Lillian tells me I owe you my life." Lucas shook his head. "You owe your sister. She's the one who refused to give up searching for you. I just provided the muscle. And the tracking skills, the knowledge of the territory, and the strategy that got us away from those men," Lillian added, pouring coffee into a tin cup and bringing it to Lucas. "Don't diminish your role," Lawrence smiled weakly. "Either way, I'm grateful to you both, those months." He paused, a shadow crossing his face. "I wasn't sure I'd ever see daylight again." "What happened?" Lucas asked, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks. "How did they capture you?" Lawrence sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "I was exploring the cave system, documenting the pictographs and natural formations. It was fascinating work. The caves are far more extensive than anyone realized." His expression darkened. "I had no idea they were already being used as a hideout. I literally stumbled upon their camp while mapping a new passage." "They've been using those caves for months," Lillian informed him. "From what we overheard, they're bank robbers lying low after a job in Helena." Lawrence nodded. "They weren't pleased to have their sanctuary discovered. At first they were going to kill me outright, but when they found my papers and realized I came from a wealthy family, they decided I might be worth more alive. They were waiting for information about your family before demanding ransom," Lucas concluded. "One of them had gone to Goldfield to investigate, which explains why you found me when you did," Lawrence realized. "Had you arrived a few days later, they might have moved me elsewhere for the exchange. The implications of their fortunate timing hung in the air. So many factors could have led to a different outcome, Lucas refusing Lillian's request for help, taking a different route to the caves, failing to discover the alternative passage that allowed them to reach Lawrence undetected. "What matters is that you're safe now," Lillian said firmly. "Once you're strong enough to travel, we'll return to Goldfield and then east, away from this territory and its dangers." Lawrence nodded in agreement, but Lucas noted a hesitation in his expression. "What is it?" he asked. Lawrence exchanged a glance with his sister before responding. "Those men had more than just weapons and supplies in those caves. They had documents, maps, deeds, banknotes that suggested their operation is far larger than just the 3 men we encountered. They're part of a larger gang with connections throughout the territory. Lucas absorbed this information thoughtfully. All the more reason for you both to return east as soon as possible. Men like that don't forgive being crossed. And what about you? Lillian asked, her gaze direct and challenging. Will you return to your previous business? The question hung between them, laden with unspoken understanding of what that business entailed. Lucas had shared his past with Lillian, his quest for vengeance against the men who had destroyed his family. 2 names remained on his list, 2 men still living who deserved justice by his reckoning. I have unfinished matters, he replied carefully. Lawrence looked between them, sensing the subtext but not fully comprehending it. Whatever your plans, Mr. Shaw, I hope they include allowing us to properly repay you once we reach civilization. The debt we owe cannot be measured. Lucas shook his head. There's no debt. Your sister paid me for my services. Financial compensation hardly covers what you've done, Lawrence insisted. You risked your life repeatedly for a stranger. The observation struck Lucas with unexpected force. He had indeed risked everything for people he barely knew, a significant departure from the single-minded pursuit of vengeance that had governed his existence for years. What's more, he had done so without hesitation or regret. Let's focus on getting you both back to Goldfield safely, Lucas deflected, uncomfortable with their gratitude. We should be able to travel by tomorrow if you continue to improve. The day passed with necessary preparations for their journey, replenishing their supplies from the cabin's stores, with payment left for the owner, at Lillian's insistence, checking and cleaning their weapons, and allowing Lawrence to regain some strength through rest and nourishment. Throughout these activities, Lucas found himself increasingly aware of Lillian's presence, the grace with which she moved, the quiet competence she displayed in every task, the occasional smile that transformed her serious features into something that caught his breath. It was a distraction he couldn't afford, yet couldn't seem to prevent. That evening, as Lawrence slept and Lucas took the first watch, Lillian joined him by the cabin door, where he sat observing the moonlit clearing beyond. "May I ask you something?" she inquired softly, settling beside him on the rough-hewn bench. Lucas nodded, steeling himself for another probing question about his past or his intentions. Instead, she asked, "What will you do when your quest is complete, when the last 2 men are dealt with?" The question caught him off guard. In truth, he had never allowed himself to contemplate life beyond his vengeance. The quest itself had become his identity, his purpose. "I haven't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "Perhaps you should," Lillian suggested gently. "Vengeance is a path with a definite end. What lies beyond that end matters." Lucas considered her words, finding them uncomfortably perceptive. "What would you have me do? Settle down, build a new life as if the past never happened." "Not as if it never happened," she corrected. "But perhaps in spite of it having happened, there's a difference between honoring the past and being imprisoned by it." The insight struck a chord deep within him. For 3 years, he had existed in a state of suspended animation, his life defined solely by the deaths he sought to deliver. The possibility of something beyond that narrow purpose was both alluring and terrifying. "Why does it matter to you what I do?" he asked, more defensively than he'd intended. Lillian met his gaze steadily, unintimidated by his tone. "Because I've seen something in you these past days that suggests there's more to Lucas Shaw than the reputation that precedes him. Something worth preserving." Her words created a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the nearby fire. Before he could formulate a response, she stood and placed a gentle hand on his uninjured shoulder. "Think about it," she said simply, before returning to her place near her brother. Lucas remained at his post, more unsettled by the brief conversation than he would have thought possible. Lillian Jones had somehow seen through the hardened exterior he presented to the world, perceiving possibilities he himself had refused to acknowledge. Morning brought clearer skies, and the decision to begin their journey back to Goldfield. Lawrence was still weak, but insisted he was strong enough to travel if they maintained a moderate pace. Lucas checked and rechecked their preparations, acutely aware of the dangers that might still lie ahead. The outlaws might have scouts watching the main trails, he warned as they prepared the horses. We'll take a longer route through the high country. It's rougher terrain but less likely to be monitored. They departed as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, leaving the cabin as they had found it. Lucas led them along game trails and narrow passes, keeping to cover where possible and remaining vigilant for any signs of pursuit. By midday, they had made good progress, the landscape gradually shifting from the rugged foothills to the more open country that would eventually lead them back to Goldfield. They paused to rest the horses near a small stream, the relative safety of their position allowing a moment of relaxation. Lawrence, who had been mostly silent during the morning's journey, approached Lucas as he refilled their canteens. "My sister tells me you're hunting the men who killed your family," he said without preamble. Lucas straightened, his expression guarded. She had no right to share that. "Perhaps not," Lawrence acknowledged, "but I'm glad she did. It helps me understand the man who saved my life." "Understanding isn't necessary for gratitude," Lucas replied curtly. Lawrence studied him thoughtfully. "No, but it might be necessary for what my sister is considering." Lucas frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've known Lillian her entire life," Lawrence said. "I recognize the signs when she's developing an attachment to someone, and despite the brevity of your acquaintance, she sees something in you that has captured her interest." The observation, delivered with brotherly directness, threw Lucas completely off balance. "You're mistaken," he insisted, though a part of him wondered if Lawrence might be right. Lawrence shrugged. "Perhaps. But if I'm not, you should know that Lillian doesn't give her heart easily or without serious consideration. If she's seeing potential in you, it's because it truly exists." Before Lucas could respond, Lillian joined them, sensing the tension in their conversation. "Is everything all right?" "Just getting better acquainted with our rescuer," Lawrence replied smoothly, sharing perspectives. Lillian glanced between them skeptically but didn't press the issue. "We should continue if we want to reach that valley before nightfall." They resumed their journey, but Lawrence's words lingered in Lucas's mind, coloring his awareness of Lillian's every glance and gesture. The possibility that she might harbor feelings for him was both flattering and alarming. Flattering, because she was unlike any woman he had encountered since Sarah's death. Alarming, because his path offered no room for attachments or future planning. The afternoon passed without incident, the trio maintaining a steady pace that accommodated Lawrence's still recovering strength. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they reached the valley. Lucas had mentioned a sheltered basin with a small lake at its center, surrounded by stands of pine and aspen. "We'll camp here," Lucas decided, indicating a level area near the lakeshore with good visibility of the surrounding terrain. "Should be safe enough for a fire if we keep it small." They established their camp with practiced efficiency, each contributing according to their abilities. Lawrence gathered firewood from the nearby trees, moving slowly but purposefully as he regained his strength. Lillian prepared a meal from their provisions, supplemented by edible plants she had gathered along the trail. Lucas secured the perimeter, establishing the same alarm system of twine and small bells that had served them well before. As night fell, they sat around the small fire, the dancing flames illuminating their faces in a warm glow. The mood was contemplative. The danger was not yet past, but they had come far from the desperate situation in the caves. "One more day's ride should bring us to Goldfield," Lucas observed, studying the stars visible through the gap in the trees above. "From there, you can arrange transportation east." "And you?" Lillian asked quietly. "What will you do once we reach town?" Lucas hesitated, aware of Lawrence watching their exchange with interest. "Continue what I started," he finally said. "I have information that one of the men I'm seeking was last seen near the Wyoming border. I'll head that way." "Alone?" The single word held a wealth of meaning in Lillian's voice. "It's better that way," Lucas replied. "Safer for everyone involved." Lawrence cleared his throat. "From what I understand, your quest has isolated you for years, Mr. Shaw. Is that isolation necessary or merely a habit you've fallen into?" The question was uncomfortably perceptive, echoing thoughts Lucas had begun to entertain himself. "Some burdens aren't meant to be shared," he answered evasively. "And some become lighter when they are," Lillian countered gently. Lucas looked at her across the fire, struck again by the quiet strength in her expression, the compassion that somehow didn't compromise her practical nature. In the days they had traveled together, she had proven herself capable, resourceful, and unexpectedly understanding of the darkness that drove him. "You both should get some rest," he said, unwilling to pursue the conversation further. "I'll take first watch." Lillian held his gaze a moment longer, then nodded and helped Lawrence prepare their bedrolls. As they settled in, Lucas moved to the edge of the camp, positioning himself where he could observe both their surroundings and the sleeping forms of his companions. The night passed peacefully, with Lucas eventually waking Lillian for the second watch before taking his own much-needed rest. Morning arrived with a misty rain that dampened the landscape, but not their spirits. They were now close enough to Goldfield that the greatest dangers seemed behind them. They broke camp quickly and continued their journey, the terrain gradually becoming more familiar as they approached the settled areas around the town. By mid-afternoon, they crested a rise that offered a view of Goldfield in the distance, its buildings clustered around the main street like toys arranged by a child's hand. "Almost there," Lucas announced, noting the relief in Lawrence's posture. The man had endured the journey admirably, but his ordeal had taken a toll that would require time and proper care to fully overcome. As they descended toward the town, Lucas became aware of a group of riders approaching from the west, 5 men moving at a purposeful pace directly toward them. He raised his hand, signaling a halt. "Company coming," he warned, reaching for his field glass. "Could be nothing, but let's be cautious." Through the glass, he examined the approaching riders, his expression darkening as he recognized the scarred face of one of the outlaws from the cave. "It's them," he confirmed grimly. "They must have been watching the approaches to town." "What do we do?" Lillian asked, her hand moving instinctively toward her revolver. Lucas assessed their options quickly. They were exposed on the hillside with limited cover. Making a run for town might work, but Lawrence's weakened condition made outpacing the pursuers unlikely. Standing and fighting was possible but risky against superior numbers. "We'll use that outcropping," he decided, indicating a formation of rocks about 50 yards to their right. "It offers defensible position with good lines of sight. Lawrence, stay with the horses in the center. Lillian and I will create a perimeter." They moved quickly to the position, dismounting and preparing for the confrontation. Lucas distributed extra ammunition to Lillian, impressed again by her calm efficiency under pressure. "If things go badly," he instructed quietly, "there's a ravine behind these rocks that leads toward town. Take Lawrence and go, don't look back." Lillian met his gaze firmly. "We're not leaving you behind." Before Lucas could argue, the outlaws had drawn close enough to hail them, spreading out in a semicircle about 100 yards away. "Shaw," the leader called, "hand over the prisoner and the woman and you can ride away, last chance." "Not going to happen," Lucas replied loudly. "You're outnumbered and outgunned, gentlemen. The smart play is to turn around and forget you ever saw us." The outlaw leader laughed harshly. "Outnumbered, I count 3 of you, 1 barely able to stand. We're 5 strong with plenty of ammunition." "Count again," came a new voice from behind the outlaws. All eyes turned to see a group of 6 riders approaching from the direction of town, led by the portly figure of Marshal Thompson from Goldfield, his badge gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Drop your weapons," the marshal commanded. "You're surrounded," the outlaws hesitated, clearly weighing their options. For a tense moment, it seemed they might choose to fight, but outnumbered and caught in a crossfire, even hardened criminals recognized a losing proposition. One by one, they lowered their weapons, their expressions a mixture of rage and resignation. As the marshal and his deputies took the outlaws into custody, Lucas felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over him. The danger was truly past now. Lawrence was safe, Lillian was unharmed, and the men who had threatened them would face justice. Marshal Thompson approached their position, his expression a mixture of surprise and grudging respect as he recognized Lucas. Shaw. Never expected to see you riding to someone's rescue. Lucas holstered his weapon. Things change, Marshal, so they do. Thompson nodded toward the captured outlaws. These men are wanted for bank robbery in Helena. There's a substantial reward for their capture. Give it to the Jones siblings, Lucas replied immediately. They're the ones who discovered the outlaws' hideout in the caves north of here. The marshal raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. You folks should come back to town. Dr. Wilson will want to look at Mr. Jones here, and I'll need statements about what happened. The return to Goldfield felt surreal to Lucas, riding openly into town alongside the marshal, accompanied by Lillian and Lawrence, receiving nods of acknowledgement rather than wary glances from the townspeople who had gathered to witness the procession. At the doctor's office, Lawrence was immediately taken in for examination, with Lillian accompanying him after extracting a promise from Lucas that he would wait for their return. Left alone in the waiting room, Lucas found himself contemplating the strange turn his life had taken. What had begun as a simple tracking job had evolved into something far more significant, not just the rescue of Lawrence Jones, but a subtle shift in his own perspective. For 3 years, he had existed solely for vengeance, allowing no other purpose or connection to distract him from his quest. Now, against all expectations, he had formed bonds that couldn't be easily dismissed or forgotten. The door opened, admitting Lillian, her expression relieved. The doctor says Lawrence will make a full recovery with proper rest and nutrition. He wants to keep him here overnight for observation, but there's no lasting damage. That's good news, Lucas replied sincerely. Lillian studied him for a moment, then took a seat beside him. Marshal Thompson says the reward for the outlaws' capture will more than cover our expenses for returning east. Lucas nodded, a strange, hollow feeling forming in his chest at the confirmation of their imminent departure. When will you leave? That depends, Lillian said carefully, on what you decide to do next. The statement caught him off guard. Me, I told you my plans. I have unfinished business to attend to. Yes, your 2 remaining targets. Lillian's voice held no judgment, merely acknowledgement of facts. But I've been thinking about what you said about some burdens not being meant to be shared. Lucas waited, uncertain where she was leading. I believe you're wrong, she continued simply. Some burdens become crushing when carried alone. Shared, they become manageable. What are you suggesting? Lucas asked, though he suspected he already knew. Lillian met his gaze directly. Come east with us. Not permanently if that's not what you want, but long enough to consider alternatives to the path you've been following. The invitation stunned him. You don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking, she countered. I'm asking you to consider that forgiveness of yourself as much as others might offer more healing than vengeance ever could. Lucas stared at her, the word reverberating in his mind, forgiveness. It was a concept he had rejected utterly since the day he had returned to find his family slaughtered. The very notion felt like a betrayal of their memory, an abandonment of the justice they deserved. I can't, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. What those men did was unforgivable, Lillian agreed softly. I'm not suggesting they don't deserve punishment, but there's a difference between justice and the consuming fire of vengeance that's burning you alive from the inside. Her perception was so accurate it physically hurt, like a probing finger in an open wound. For 3 years, Lucas had been consumed by his quest, allowing it to hollow him out until nothing remained but the shell of the man he had once been. Even if I wanted to, he began uncertainly, I'm not sure I know how to let it go. Lillian's hand found his, her touch gentle but grounding. You don't have to know right now, just be willing to consider the possibility. That's all I'm asking. The contact between them, simple, human connection without agenda or threat, broke something open within Lucas. A wall he had built so carefully, maintained so vigilantly, suddenly revealed a crack that threatened the entire structure. Why? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would you offer this to someone like me? Lillian's expression softened. Because in the midst of your darkness, I've seen flashes of the man you once were, the man you could be again. A man of principle and courage, capable of compassion as well as strength. Before Lucas could respond, the door opened again, admitting Marshall Thompson with a stack of papers in hand. "Need those statements now if you're up to it," the marshal announced, oblivious to the intimate moment he had interrupted. "Got to get these reports filed while the details are fresh." Lillian withdrew her hand from Lucas's, though the warmth of her touch lingered. "Of course, Marshal, we're ready whenever you are." The next hours passed in a blur of official statements and arrangements. The captured outlaws were secured in the town jail, awaiting transfer to Helena for trial. Lawrence was resting comfortably under the doctor's care. The reward money was processed and allocated as Lucas had requested. Through it all, Lucas moved as if in a dream, his mind still grappling with Lillian's words and the choice they represented. By evening, he found himself alone in his rented cabin on the edge of town, staring at the worn piece of paper that had guided his existence for so long. 2 names remained. 2 men still living who had participated in the destruction of everything he had once held dear. The knowledge of their continued existence had been both torment and purpose for 3 long years. Could he simply set it aside, walk away from the quest that had defined him? The very thought felt like sacrilege. A knock at the door interrupted his contemplation. He opened it to find Lillian standing on his porch, her expression determined yet gentle. "May I come in?" she asked. Lucas hesitated, then stepped aside to admit her. The small cabin suddenly felt even more cramped with her presence filling it, not physically, but in the indefinable way she seemed to bring life and energy wherever she went. "Lawrence is sleeping comfortably," she informed him, though he hadn't asked. "The doctor is confident he'll be strong enough to travel within a week." Lucas nodded, uncertain how to respond. The practiced social interactions he had once known seemed to have atrophied from disuse, leaving him awkward and tongue-tied. Lillian's gaze fell on the paper still clutched in his hand. "Your list," she observed. He didn't deny it, merely folded it and returned it to his pocket. "Old habits." "Lucas," she began, his name soft on her lips, "I meant what I said earlier. You have a choice before you continue down the path of vengeance or consider an alternative." "And if I'm not strong enough for that alternative?" he asked, voicing the fear that had been growing since their conversation at the doctor's office. Lillian stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes, smell the faint lavender scent that somehow persisted despite their rugged journey. "You are the strongest man I've ever known," she said with quiet certainty. "Strong enough to survive loss that would have destroyed most people, strong enough to risk your life for strangers, strong enough to consider forgiveness even when it feels impossible." "Forgiveness," he repeated, the word still foreign and uncomfortable on his tongue. "Not for them," Lillian clarified, somehow understanding his struggle. "For yourself. For surviving when they didn't, for being unable to protect them, for all the guilt you've carried alongside your vengeance." The precision of her insight struck Lucas like a physical blow, forcing him to confront truths he had buried beneath his quest for revenge. The guilt had indeed been his constant companion, that he had not been there when his family needed him, that he had lived while they died, that he had failed in the most fundamental duty of a husband and father. "How did you know?" he asked hoarsely. Lillian's expression held infinite compassion. "Because I've carried my own guilt. When our parents died, I was away at school. Lawrence was the one who sat with them through their final days. I've always wondered if they felt my absence, if they thought I had abandoned them for my own pursuits." "I'm sure they didn't," Lucas said automatically, the response coming from a place of empathy he had thought long dead. "Perhaps not," Lillian acknowledged with a sad smile. "Just as your wife and son wouldn't blame you for not being there." "But knowing that intellectually doesn't ease the heart's burden, does it?" Lucas shook his head, words failing him in the face of such perfect understanding. "The difference," Lillian continued gently, "is that I've had Lawrence to help me carry that burden. You've had no one." The simple truth of her statement broke something free within Lucas, a dam of emotion he had held in check for 3 years. Without warning or preamble, tears filled his eyes, spilling down his weathered cheeks in silent testimony to his long-suppressed grief. Lillian didn't speak, didn't offer empty platitudes or awkward comfort. She simply stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, offering her strength as his own faltered. Lucas stood rigid for a moment, unused to physical contact that didn't involve threat or violence. Then, slowly, his arms encircled her, accepting the connection she offered. They remained that way for what might have been minutes or hours, the quiet intimacy of shared understanding bridging gaps that words could not. When Lucas finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion but clearer somehow, as if a weight had been partially lifted. "I don't know if I can be the man you think you see." Lillian drew back slightly, meeting his gaze. "I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are, a man who has survived terrible loss and stands at a crossroads. The choice of direction is yours alone, but you don't have to walk the path in solitude anymore." The offer implicit in her words was both terrifying and exhilarating. Lucas had become accustomed to isolation, to depending solely on himself. The possibility of connection, of sharing not just his burden but perhaps his future, was almost too much to contemplate. "I need time," he said finally, "to think, to consider." Lillian nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Of course, as I said, Lawrence won't be fit to travel for at least a week. There's no rush for decisions." She moved toward the door, pausing with her hand on the latch. "Whatever you decide, Lucas Shaw, know that you've earned my respect," and she hesitated, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "And my affection. That won't change, regardless of the path you choose." With that, she was gone, leaving Lucas standing in the center of his sparse cabin, feeling as though the foundations of his world had shifted beneath his feet. The days that followed were a time of profound introspection for Lucas. He visited Lawrence daily at the doctor's office, initially out of a sense of obligation, but increasingly because he found himself enjoying the man's thoughtful conversation and genuine interest in the world around him. Lawrence, for his part, seemed to understand the internal struggle Lucas was facing, offering neither pressure nor judgment, merely companionship and occasional insights that suggested he was more aware of the situation between Lucas and his sister than either of them had openly acknowledged. "She's quite remarkable, isn't she?" Lawrence commented casually during one such visit, as they sat on the doctor's porch watching the townspeople go about their business. "Stubborn as the day is long, but with a heart that sees worth in places others overlook." Lucas nodded, knowing exactly who she referred to. "Your sister is unlike anyone I've ever met." "She believes in second chances," Lawrence continued. "Not just for others, but for herself as well. It's what drove her to search for me when most would have accepted my disappearance as final." "She never gave up on you," Lucas observed. Lawrence smiled. "No, she didn't, and she won't give up on you either if you give her reason to hope." The conversation lingered in Lucas's mind as he went about his days in Goldfield, a strange limbo between his old life and whatever might come next. He found himself noticing details about the town. He had previously ignored the schoolchildren playing in the street during recess, the women chatting as they hung laundry to dry, the men gathered outside the general store discussing crops and weather. Ordinary life. The kind he had once taken for granted, then dismissed as irrelevant to his quest for vengeance. Now he found himself wondering if such normalcy might still be possible for him, or if he had strayed too far from its shores to ever return. On the 5th day after their return to Goldfield, Lucas made a decision. He saddled his horse early in the morning and rode out of town, not toward the Wyoming border as many might have expected, but in another direction entirely. He returned late that evening, dust-covered and weary, but with a sense of purpose that had been absent before. Without stopping at his cabin, he went directly to the hotel where Lillian was staying, requesting to see her despite the late hour. She came down to the small lobby, concern evident in her expression when she saw his trail-worn appearance. "Lucas, is everything all right? Can we talk?" he asked simply. "Somewhere private," Lillian nodded, leading him to a small sitting room off the main lobby that was empty at this hour. Once inside, with the door closed behind them, she turned to him expectantly. Lucas took a deep breath, gathering his courage. I rode to Bear Creek today, he began, to the place where we found Lawrence's journal, Lillian's brow furrowed in confusion. Why? Because I needed to make a choice, Lucas explained, withdrawing the worn paper from his pocket, the list that had guided his existence for 3 years. And I needed the right place to do it. Understanding dawned in Lillian's eyes as Lucas carefully tore the paper in half, then quarters, then smaller still until only fragments remained. He opened his hand, allowing the pieces to fall to the floor between them. I can't promise I'll never think of them again, he said quietly. Or that the anger won't sometimes return, but I'm choosing a different path, one that doesn't end in more bloodshed. Lillian's eyes shone with unshed tears. What made you decide? Lucas met her gaze directly. You did. By offering forgiveness for my darkest aspects without even asking why they existed. By seeing something in me worth salvaging when I had given up on myself. He paused, searching for the right words. You reminded me that there can be life after loss. That the best way to honor those we've loved is to live fully, not just exist in the shadow of their absence. Lillian stepped closer, her expression a mixture of joy and tentative hope. And what does this new path look like? I'm not entirely sure, Lucas admitted honestly. But I'd like to find out, with you if you're willing. The words, once spoken, seemed to hang in the air between them, an offering, a possibility, a future not yet written but potentially shared. Lillian reached for his hand, her fingers warm and steady against his calloused palm. I would like nothing more, she replied softly. In that moment, in a small hotel sitting room in a frontier town called Goldfield, Lucas Shaw found something he had thought forever beyond his reach, not just forgiveness, but the chance to begin again, to build rather than destroy, to love rather than hate. 1 week later, Lucas stood on the train platform beside Lillian and Lawrence, their luggage loaded and tickets secured for the journey east. The town of Goldfield spread out behind them, bathed in morning sunlight that seemed somehow brighter than Lucas remembered. Are you certain about this? Lawrence asked him one final time. Leaving everything you've known, Lucas glanced around at the frontier town that had been both refuge and prison for him these past years. What I'm leaving behind isn't worth keeping, he replied. What lies ahead is. As the train pulled into the station with a hiss of steam and screech of brakes, Lucas felt Lillian's hand slip into his, a simple gesture that grounded him in the present while offering promise for the future. Ready? She asked, her green eyes bright with anticipation. Lucas nodded, a smile rare and genuine crossing his features. Ready. They boarded the train together, finding their seats as the conductor called the final boarding announcement. As the whistle blew and the great iron beast lurched into motion, Lucas watched the landscape of his past begin to recede through the window. For 3 years, he had been known as the Unforgiving, a man defined by his implacable pursuit of vengeance. Now, thanks to a woman who had offered understanding without demand and forgiveness without question, he was simply Lucas Shaw again, a man with wounds that might never fully heal, but also with the capacity for love, for growth, for a future brighter than his past. The train gathered speed, carrying them eastward toward new beginnings. Beside him, Lillian rested her head against his shoulder, a gesture of trust and affection that still amazed him. Across from them, Lawrence smiled knowingly, his own recovery progressing well under his sister's watchful care. As mountains gave way to plains and the frontier began to fade behind them, Lucas realized that for the first time in years, he was looking forward rather than back. The road ahead was uncertain, but he would not walk it alone, and in that knowledge, he found a peace he had thought forever beyond his reach. In the end, Lucas Shaw discovered that the truest form of justice wasn't found at the end of a gun, but in the courage to embrace life again after devastating loss. And though he would always carry the scars of his past, they no longer defined the boundaries of his existence. Through Lillian's unwavering belief in his better nature, he had found not just forgiveness, but redemption, and with it, the promise of a love that healed rather than harmed, that built rather than destroyed, that looked forward with hope rather than backward with rage. It was, perhaps, the greatest journey of all.